The summer that the sky forgot how to weep, Emma Thatcher stood at the edge of her father's dying land and made a promise so fierce it cracked her voice in two, never once dreaming that the heavens themselves might be listening. It was the summer of 1878, in the Texas Panhandle, where the grass had once grown tall enough to brush a man's stirrup, and the Canadian River had run wide and brown and full of life. That year the river had shrunk to a trickle of cracked mud, and the grass had gone the color of old bone. For 14 months no rain worth speaking of had fallen on the Thatcher ranch, nor on any of the spreads for 50 miles around, and the cattle had grown thin as fence posts, their ribs showing through hide the color of dust. Emma was 24 years old, and she had buried her father 2 summers before, laid him in the hard ground beneath the lone cottonwood that still, against all reason, clung to life beside the old well house. Since then the ranch, 4,000 acres of range that her father, Everett Thatcher, had carved out of raw prairie with nothing but a wagon, a rifle, and a stubbornness that Emma had inherited whole, had been hers to keep or lose. She had a 16-year-old brother, Tommy, all elbows and hope, who worked the herd beside her from before dawn until the stars came out. She had an old hired hand named Silas Reed, gray-bearded and slow-moving but steady as a millstone, who had ridden for her father since before Emma was born. And she had 200 head of cattle that were dying by the week, one after another, folding down into the dust and not getting up again. She was proud, and she was frightened, though she let no one see the second thing. The well behind the house had gone from a hand's depth of water to nothing but a smell of wet stone that reminded her, cruelly, of what water used to be. The stock tank that fed the north pasture had cracked into plates like the shell of some great dead turtle. Each morning Emma rode the fence line and counted the cattle that had not made it through the night, and each morning there were more, and each morning she told herself that tomorrow the sky would change its mind. It was on a Tuesday in the middle of July, with the sun, a hammer, and the wind carrying nothing but the smell of scorched grass, that Jedediah Cross rode onto Thatcher land with 2 of his men flanking him, and Emma knew before he opened his mouth that he had come to pick at her bones. Cross owned the Lazy Sea, the largest spread in 3 counties, and he had wanted the Thatcher land for longer than Emma had been alive, mostly on account of Willow Spring, a stubborn seep of water high on the ridge that fed a shallow creek running down through Thatcher property before it ever reached Cross land. Even in this drought, the spring still gave a trickle, more than any other water source for 20 miles, and everyone from Amarillo to the Canadian Breaks knew it. "Miss Thatcher," Cross said, tipping his hat with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. He was a big man running to fat, with a mustache waxed into points and a voice like gravel poured slow. "I heard you lost another dozen head this week. Shame, real shame." "We are managing, Mr. Cross," Emma said, standing her ground in the yard with her hands on her hips and dust on her boots. "I do not recall inviting you. No need for an invitation between neighbors." He smiled, showing a gold tooth. "I have come to make an offer, same as I have made twice before. $3 an acre for the whole spread, cattle included, such as they are. It is more than fair, given the state of things. You could take your brother and go somewhere with water in the ground, somewhere kinder than this." "This is my father's land," Emma said. "It will not be sold while I draw breath." Cross's smile thinned. "Pride does not fill a stock tank, Miss Thatcher. This drought is not finished with you. I give it until the end of August before you are begging me to take it for $2. "Then you will have a long wait," Emma said, "because I intend to still be standing here when the rains come back, and they will come back, Mr. Cross, same as they always have." He looked at her a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, and then he turned his horse and rode off with his men, and Emma stood in the yard with her heart hammering and her knees weak beneath her skirts, because she had spoken with more confidence than she felt. That night, after Tommy and Silas had gone to their beds, Emma could not sleep. She walked out past the barn, past the corral where the last of the milk cows stood with their heads low, and up the low ridge behind the house where her father used to sit some evenings with his pipe, looking out over land that in his day had been green clear to the horizon. The sky above her was a bowl of hard stars, cloudless as it had been for over a year, mocking in its clarity. Emma stood there with the wind pulling at her hair, and something in her chest that had been coiled tight for 2 years finally broke open. "I know you cannot hear me," she said aloud to the stars, to the great empty dark, her voice rough with 2 years of grief and worry she had never once let herself release. "I know praying to the sky is a fool's business, but I am asking anyway because I do not know what else to do. My father broke his back on this land. My brother has never known anything else. I have buried enough already. I will not bury this ranch too." She drew a breath that shook on the way in. "I won't let this drought take everything I love," she said, louder now, throwing the words up at the indifferent stars like a challenge. "Do you hear me? I do not care how long it takes or what it costs me. I will find a way, with rain or without it, but I would be obliged if you would send some rain." The wind answered with nothing but the dry rustle of dead grass, and somewhere far off a coyote called, and Emma stood there a long while longer with tears drying salty on her cheeks before she walked back down to the house and finally slept. She did not know, could not have known, that 4 miles east, a lone rider was making camp beside the last standing water in the county, a horse gone lame beneath him and a canteen gone dry, and that in the morning he would follow the only green line on the horizon straight to her door. Cecil Garrison had been riding for 6 weeks when he came upon the failing spring that fed into Thatcher land. He was 29 years old, lean and weathered from a decade spent mostly outdoors, with sun-browned skin and pale gray eyes that had seen a great deal of country, and not all of it kind. He had ridden the Kishome Trail 3 times as a young man, driving cattle up from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, and he had worked as a line rider, a fence builder, a well digger, and once, briefly and disastrously, a rancher in his own right. That last part was the reason he was riding alone through the Panhandle with little more than his horse, his saddle, a rifle, and the clothes on his back. 4 years before in Kansas, Cecil had owned 40 acres and a small herd, inherited from his own father, and a drought not unlike this one had taken it from him one dry season at a time, until the bank took the rest. He had watched his cattle die the same slow way Emma's were dying now, had watched the creek that ran through his land turn to a snake of cracked mud, and he had learned, in the bitterest school there was, exactly what it meant to lose everything a man loved to a sky that would not open. Since then he had drifted, working here and there, never staying long enough to plant roots that could be torn up again. But he had learned things in his drifting, how to find water where none seemed to be, a trick an old Comanche man had taught him one winter in exchange for tobacco and medicine, using nothing but a forked willow branch and a patience most men did not have. He had learned to dig a well true and deep, to build a dam that would hold, to read the sky for what little truth it would give. His horse, a rangy bay gelding named Samson, had gone lame 2 days before on a stone bruise, and Cecil had walked the last several miles leading him, his own canteen dry since noon. When he crested a rise and saw, below him, a ranch house with smoke curling from its chimney, and beyond it, a windmill turning slow and creaking in the hot wind, he said a silent thank you to whatever Providence had put it there. Emma was in the yard drawing what little water the well would give when she saw the stranger coming, a tall man leading a limping horse, dust-covered and clearly spent. Her first instinct, honed by 2 years of hard lessons and Jedediah crosses circling vultures, was suspicion. Her second, older and deeper than caution, was the plain fact that no decent person turned away a thirsty man and a suffering animal in country like this. "That is close enough," she called out when he was 50 yards off, and she was not surprised to see him stop immediately, hands lifted a little away from his sides in a gesture of peace. "I do not mean any trouble, ma'am," he called back, his voice carrying easy across the still air. My horse has gone lame and my canteen has been dry since noon. I would be grateful for water for him and for me both, and I am glad to work for it if that eases your mind." Emma studied him a long moment. He did not look like one of Cross's men, and he did not carry himself with the swagger of a drifter looking for easy pickings. There was something tired in the way he stood, tired all the way down, that she recognized because she felt it herself most days. "Come ahead slow," she said. "Silas is in the barn and he keeps a rifle handy." "Understood, ma'am." He came forward leading the limping bay, and up close Emma could see the horse's foreleg was swollen and hot, and the man's own lips were cracked with thirst, though he had clearly given his last water to the animal rather than himself, judging by how he swayed slightly on his feet. "You gave him the last of your water," she said, not quite a question. "He cannot ask for it himself," Cecil said simply. "Seemed only right." Something in that answer settled a portion of Emma's wariness. She led him to the trough by the barn, poured the last of what the well had given that morning, and watched the horse drink in long, grateful pulls, while the man himself accepted a dipper of water from Silas with a nod of thanks so genuine it startled her. "Name is Cecil Garrison," he said, once the worst of his thirst was answered. "I have worked cattle, dug wells, and mended more fence than I care to count." "I am not looking for charity, Miss Thatcher," Emma said. "Emma Thatcher. This is my brother Tommy, and that is Silas Reed, who has worked this ranch longer than I have been alive." Silas, sizing up the stranger with the same slow care he gave everything, finally grunted something that might have been approval. "Horse needs that leg poultice before it gets worse," he said. "I have got mud and vinegar for it if you are willing to trust an old man's doctoring." "I would be grateful," Cecil said, and something in the plain courtesy of it, the lack of any false pride, made Emma decide, against the whole of her caution, to let him stay the night. Over a supper of beans and salt pork, thin as it was these lean months, Cecil told them a little of himself, the Kansas ranch, the drought that had taken it, the years since spent drifting from job to job across half a dozen territories. He did not dress it up or ask for pity, simply laid the facts out plain the way a man might describe weather, and Emma found herself listening with an attention she had not given a stranger in a long while. "You know this land is dying," she said finally, when the meal was done and Tommy had gone to check the stock one last time before dark. "Cross was here Tuesday, offering to buy me out for pennies on the dollar. He thinks I will crawl to him by August." "Do you aim to prove him wrong?" Cecil asked, and there was no mockery in it, only a plain question. "I aim to," Emma said, "though I confess I do not rightly know how." Cecil was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup slow in his hands. "I have found water in worse country than this," he said finally. "Not always much, and not always where a man expects it, but sometimes enough to matter. I could look around your land tomorrow if you would permit it. Would not cost you anything but a meal, and a place in the barn to sleep." Emma searched his face for the angle, the trick, the thing men like Cross always seemed to be hiding, and found nothing there but tiredness and a strange, quiet hope that mirrored her own. "All right," she said. "Look around tomorrow. I will not turn away help I have not asked to pay for." That night, lying in her narrow bed with the window open to whatever breeze the dark might offer, Emma thought of the vow she had shouted at the stars 2 nights before, and could not shake the odd feeling that something had shifted, however small, in the turning of the world. Cecil Garrison rose before dawn, as was his habit, and by the time Emma came out to milk the one cow still giving anything worth the name, she found him already walking the low ground behind the house with a forked willow branch held loose in both hands, moving slow and careful across the cracked earth like a man reading a book only he could see. "What in the world are you doing?" she asked, coming to stand at a respectful distance. "Dowsing," he said, not looking up. "An old man taught me the trick of it years back. Some folks call it witching for water. I cannot rightly explain how it works, only that it has worked for me more often than not." "Silas says that is nonsense," Emma said, though there was more curiosity than scorn in it. "Silas may be right," Cecil allowed with the ghost of a smile. but nonsense has filled my canteen more than once, so I keep at it." She watched him work his way across the yard, the willow branch trembling faintly here and there, until near the base of the ridge, not 30 yards from the old dry well, the branch bent down hard and sudden, as though yanked by some invisible hand, and Cecil stopped in his tracks. "Here," he said. "If there is water left under this land at all, it will be here and deep. I would guess 20, maybe 25 feet, judging by how strong the pull is." "The old well is only 12 feet down, and it has been dry 2 months, Emma said. "Then we go deeper," Cecil said, and there was something in the set of his jaw, some old stubbornness that matched her own, that made her believe him. It took 9 days of brutal labor to dig the new well, working in shifts through the worst heat of the day and into the cooler dark of evening. Cecil and Tommy taking turns in the narrowing shaft with pick and shovel, while Silas worked the windlass above, and Emma hauled the buckets of spoil away, and kept the men fed and watered from what little they had. Cecil worked like a man who had something to prove, though Emma could not always tell if it was to her, to Cross, or to some old ghost of his own failed Kansas ranch. On the 9th evening, with the shaft down past 22 feet and Tommy below swinging the pick in the gathering dark, there came a shout from below that brought them all running to the well head. "Water!" Tommy's voice came up hollow and disbelieving from the depths. "Miss Emma, there is water coming up around my boots." They pulled him up laughing and dripping, and Cecil lowered a bucket on the rope and drew it up brim full of water, cloudy with sediment but water all the same, more water than the ranch had seen in one place in over a year. Emma took the bucket in both hands and stood there staring at it as though she could not quite believe it was real, and when she looked up at Cecil, standing there dust-covered and grinning in the last of the daylight, something turned over in her chest that had nothing to do with wells or drought at all. "You found it," she said, her voice unsteady. "We found it," Cecil corrected. "Your brother did half the digging, and your own stubbornness kept us all fed and moving. I only pointed the way." "Thank you," Emma said, and meant it with a fullness that surprised her, and for a long moment neither of them looked away, until Silas cleared his throat pointedly and asked whether anyone intended to rig the pump before full dark or stand there admiring each other all night. The new well did not solve everything. It gave enough water for the house and the immediate stock, but not nearly enough to fill the empty stock tanks across 4,000 acres of dying range. But it gave Emma something she had not had in 2 years, which was hope with a little water behind it. Cecil stayed on. He told himself it was because the work was not finished, because a man ought to see a job through, because Samson's leg needed another week to heal before he could ride hard again. He did not tell himself, not at first, that it was because he found himself watching for Emma Thatcher's laugh the way another man might watch for rain, or because the sound of her voice calling the men in to supper had become, in the space of 2 short weeks, a thing he looked forward to more than he had looked forward to anything in a long while. Over the following weeks, as the brutal Texas summer wore on, Cecil made himself useful in a dozen ways beyond the well. He helped repair the leaning windmill that had not turned true in years, replacing a cracked vane with wood salvaged from an old wagon bed. He helped Silas build a small earthen dam across the dry wash below Willow Spring, so that when rain did eventually come, what little there was would not simply run off into the parched ground but would pool and soak deep where the cattle could reach it. He rode fence with Tommy and taught the boy how to read the small signs of water in the land, the particular green of certain grasses, the way cottonwoods clustered where roots could still find moisture below. And in the evenings, after the work was done and the stars had come out hard and bright over the plains, he and Emma took to sitting on the porch steps together, not always talking, sometimes simply watching the dark come down over the land they were both, in their different ways, fighting to save. "Tell me about your father's place in Kansas," Emma said one such evening, the crickets loud in the dry grass around them. Cecil was quiet a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "It was good land once," he said finally. "Rolling and green, with a creek that never went dry, not until it did. My father built that place with his own hands, same as yours did here. When the drought came, I fought it the same way you are fighting now. Dug wells, hauled water, prayed more than I had ever prayed in my life. It was not enough. The bank took it in the end, and I rode away from it because I could not bear to watch someone else's cattle graze where mine had once grazed. I am sorry, Emma said softly. Do not be. It taught me things I would not otherwise know, and some of those things have been useful to you, so perhaps it was not entirely wasted. He looked over at her, his gray eyes catching the last light. What I could not do for my own place, Miss Thatcher, I find myself wanting very badly to do for yours. Emma felt her breath catch a little at the plain honesty of it, and she did not trust herself to answer right away. Why? She asked finally, quietly. Because I have watched you ride out every morning before the sun is properly up and come back after dark and never once complain, not where your brother or Silas could hear it, Cecil said. Because you have more grit in you than any 3 men I have driven cattle with. And because, he stopped himself, looking away toward the dark line of the ridge. Because, Emma pressed, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. Because I have not felt this alive in 4 years, Cecil said finally, low. Not since before I lost everything. I do not rightly know what to make of that or of you, Miss Thatcher, but I find I am in no hurry to ride on and find out. Emma sat very still, aware of the small distance between them on the porch step, aware of her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Then do not, she said simply. Stay as long as you find reason to. It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was enough, and Cecil Garrison found himself smiling in the dark in a way he had not smiled in a long time. August came in hot and merciless, and with it came Jedediah Cross once more, this time with a proposition dressed up as neighborliness that fooled no one. He rode up on a Sunday afternoon while Emma, Cecil, and Tommy were mending fence along the eastern boundary, and this time he came alone, which Emma found more unsettling than his usual pair of hired men. Miss Thatcher, he said, tipping his hat with that same false courtesy. I hear you have found yourself a new well. Congratulations, must be a comfort. It is, Emma said shortly, not pausing in her work. Cross's eyes slid to Cecil, taking his measure with the frank appraisal of a man used to buying and selling livestock. And who might this be? Another hired hand or something more? This is Cecil Garrison, Emma said, straightening. He has been a great help to this ranch, and I do not see that it is any business of yours, Mr. Cross. No business at all, Cross agreed easily, though his eyes stayed on Cecil a beat longer than was comfortable. I only came to renew my offer, seeing as the drought shows no sign of breaking. $4 an acre now, on account of your new well, generous as I am, still willing to take the whole spread off your hands. The answer is still no, Emma said. It will be no in September and no in October, and no however many times you care to ask. Cross's smile finally slipped, showing something colder beneath. You are a stubborn woman, Miss Thatcher, same as your father was a stubborn man, and stubbornness has a way of costing folks dear in country like this. That spring on your ridge feeds my land as much as yours, and I have half a mind to dam it up on my side and let you see how you fare without it. That water rights belongs to Thatcher land by first claim, filed with the county the year my father settled here, Emma said, her voice sharp as a blade. You try damming that spring, and you will find yourself in front of a judge in Amarillo faster than you can spit. Cross's jaw worked, and for a moment Emma thought he might say something truly ugly, but instead he simply turned his horse. We will see how the summer goes, he said over his shoulder and rode off without another word. Cecil watched him go, a hard look settling over his usually easy features. That man means to have this land one way or another, he said quietly. He has meant to have it since before my father died, Emma said, some of the fire going out of her now that Cross was gone, replaced by a weariness that made her shoulders sag. I do not know how much longer I can keep fighting him and the sky both. You are not fighting either one alone, Cecil said, and reached out, hesitant, to take her hand, and Emma let him, standing there in the dying afternoon light with the dry wind pulling at her skirts, feeling for the first time in 2 years that perhaps she truly was not alone in this. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, the whole of the small ranching community gathered at the schoolhouse in the little town of Solace Creek for a dance, as was the custom every few months when work allowed, a chance for scattered families to see each other's faces and remember they were not the only ones fighting the same dry battle. Emma had not planned to go. There seemed little cause for dancing with the cattle dying and the well barely sufficient, but Tommy had begged, and Silas had gruffly insisted that a person needed joy same as they needed water, and in the end it was Cecil's quiet suggestion, offered almost shyly, that decided her. "I have not danced in longer than I care to admit," he said, "but I would be glad of the company, Miss Thatcher, if you would permit me to escort you." The schoolhouse was strung with lanterns, and a fiddle and a guitar provided the music, and for a few hours Emma allowed herself to forget the drought and cross and the weight of 4,000 acres resting on her shoulders. She danced with Cecil twice, and though neither of them were skilled at it, there was something in the way his hand rested careful and warm at her waist, in the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the crowded, sweating room, that made her feel lighter than she had in years. It was during a break in the music, while they stood together near the open door catching what breeze the night offered, that a young rancher named Willis Boone, who had made no secret in the past of his interest in Emma, approached with a scowl. "Emma Thatcher," he said, ignoring Cecil entirely, "I had thought to ask you to dance before this drifter got his hooks in you." "Mr. Boone," Emma said, cool as she could manage, "Cecil Garrison is a guest on my ranch and my friend, and I would thank you to speak of him with more respect." "Friend," Boone repeated, with an ugly little laugh. "Everyone knows cross means to have your land eventually, Emma. Best you think about your future before you go throwing it in with some saddle tramp who will be gone come first frost." Cecil's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, only stood a little straighter, and it was Emma who stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "My future is my own to decide, Willis Boone, same as it has always been, and I will thank you not to speak for me at a dance or anywhere else." She turned deliberately to Cecil, offering her hand. "Would you care to dance again, Mr. Garrison?" "I would be honored, Miss Thatcher," Cecil said, and led her back onto the floor with a small, satisfied smile, leaving Boone standing red-faced by the door. Later that night, riding back to the ranch under a sky still stubbornly clear of clouds, Cecil brought his horse alongside Emma's. "He was not entirely wrong, you know," he said quietly. "I have no land, no fortune, nothing to offer a woman like you beyond a strong back and a willingness to work." "Cecil Garrison," Emma said, reining in her horse so that they sat facing each other in the moonlight, "I have watched you dig wells until your hands bled, ride fence in the worst heat of summer, and stand up to Jedediah Cross without flinching, all for a ranch that is not even yours. If that is not worth more than land or fortune, then I do not know what is." Cecil looked at her a long moment, the moon silver on the planes of his face, and then, slow and careful, as though asking permission with every inch of movement, he leaned across the space between their horses and kissed her. It was not a long kiss, nor a bold one, but it was enough to leave them both breathless when it ended, and Emma pressed her fingers briefly to her lips as though to hold the feeling there. "I have wanted to do that for some weeks now," Cecil admitted, a little rough in his voice. "I am glad you finally worked up the courage," Emma said, smiling in the dark, and they rode the rest of the way home with their hands linked between the horses, saying little more, needing to say little more. But the sky remained cloudless through the rest of August, and the cattle continued to die, and beneath the new sweetness of falling in love ran an undercurrent of dread that Emma could not fully banish, because love, however true, could not by itself make rain. September brought the crisis that had been building all summer, arriving not from the sky but from Jedediah Cross's own hand. It began with the fences. Emma rode out one morning in the second week of September to find nearly a mile of her northern boundary fence cut and trampled. The wire snipped clean in a dozen places, deliberate and malicious. 20 head of the remaining cattle had wandered through the gap in the night, scattering across the open range, and it took Cecil, Tommy, and Silas the better part of 2 days to round most of them back, though 3 were never found at all, likely lost to rustlers or simply strayed too far to trace in the dry, featureless country. "This was Cross's men," Cecil said grimly, examining the cleanly cut wire. "No animal did this, and no honest accident either." "I cannot prove it," Emma said, frustration and fear warring in her voice. "And even if I could, the sheriff in Amarillo is 2 days' ride and none too eager to trouble himself over a woman's fence line." Worse came a week later, when Silas rode up to the house at a dead run, something Emma had never before seen the old man do, his weathered face pale beneath its tan. "Willow Spring," he gasped, swinging down from his horse. "Cross has men up there right now, building some manner of dam across the seep on his side of the property line. If they finish it, near all the water will pool on his land and none will come down to us at all." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Willow Spring, even reduced to a trickle, was the difference between the ranch's survival and its collapse. Without it, the new well alone could not sustain the herd through what remained of the drought. "We ride now," Cecil said, already moving toward his saddled horse, his face set in hard lines Emma had not seen on him before. "Emma, you have the paper proving first water rights." "In my father's strongbox," Emma said, already running for the house. They rode hard for the ridge, Emma with the yellowed legal document clutched in one hand, Cecil beside her, Tommy and Silas close behind, and topped the rise to find exactly what Silas had described. A half-dozen of Cross's men working with picks and shovels to pile stone and earth across the narrow channel where the spring's water made its way down toward Thatcher land, and Jedediah Cross himself sitting his horse nearby, overseeing the work with evident satisfaction. "Cross!" Emma shouted, reining in hard, her horse skidding in the loose dirt. "Call your men off this instant. You are damming water that belongs to Thatcher land by first claim, filed and recorded, and you know it." Cross turned his horse unhurried to face her, unbothered by the fury in her voice. "This dam sits entirely on my property, Miss Thatcher. What a man does on his own land is his own affair. The spring itself may rise on your side of the line, but the flow has always run onto my property, and the water rights were filed accordingly, before you ever set foot in this county," Emma said, holding up the document with a hand that shook only slightly. "I have the paper here to prove it, filed and stamped by the county clerk in Amarillo in 1861. You dam this water and you are stealing, plain and simple, and I will see you in front of a judge for it." Something flickered across Cross's face, not quite doubt, but a calculation of risk that had not been there before. He had perhaps not expected her to actually possess the paper, or to be so certain of it. "Judges can be slow to act on a woman's word," he said, though with less certainty than before. "Then you had best hope the judge in Amarillo has more honor than you do," Cecil said, moving his horse up alongside Emma's, his voice low and hard. "Because I will personally ride the 2 days to fetch him if that is what it takes, and I will bring back every rancher within 50 miles who has ever watched their own water stolen by a man too greedy to leave his neighbors a fair share." Cross's eyes moved between them, weighing something, and then, with a curse muttered under his breath, he raised a hand and called his men off the half-built dam. "This is not finished, Miss Thatcher," he said, though the words carried less weight than his earlier threats. "The drought is not finished either, and one legal paper will not save your ranch if the sky never opens again." "Perhaps not," Emma said, sitting straight in her saddle, Cecil close beside her, Tommy and Silas flanking them, 4 people bound together in defense of a piece of dry, stubborn land. "But it will not be stolen from me while I still draw breath, Mr. Cross, and neither will this water." Cross wheeled his horse and rode off with his men, leaving the half-built dam standing as an ugly scar across the hillside, and Emma sat there shaking with the release of tension until Cecil reached over and laid a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You did that," he said quietly. "That was you standing your ground, not me." "I could not have done it without knowing you were beside me," Emma admitted. And in that moment, with the dry wind pulling at her hair and the ruined dam a testament to how close disaster had come, she understood with sudden clarity that whatever happened with the drought, with the ranch, with the uncertain future, she wanted Cecil Garrison beside her for the whole of it. They tore down the remainder of Cross's Dam themselves that same afternoon, restoring the spring's natural flow, and rode home in the gathering dusk feeling, for the first time in weeks, that they had won something, however small and however temporary. But the reprieve did not last. 3 days later, the drought delivered its cruelest blow yet, in the form of fire. It began, as such things often did in that parched country, from something as small as a spark from a cookfire carried on the wind, catching in grass gone dry as tinder after 14 months without meaningful rain. Emma first smelled the smoke on the wind while hanging washing behind the house, a sharp acrid scent that sent ice through her veins even before she saw the gray smudge rising against the hard blue sky to the southwest, exactly where the largest remaining stretch of grazing land lay, and exactly where perhaps 150 head of cattle, all that remained of the Thatcher herd, were spread across the range. "Fire!" she screamed, dropping the washing and running for the barn. "Cecil, Tommy, Silas. Fire on the south range." They came running, and within minutes the 4 of them were mounted and riding hard toward the rising smoke, Cecil shouting instructions over the wind, wet sacks, shovels, anything that could beat down flame or throw dirt across it. Though even as he shouted it, Emma could see in his face that he understood, as she did, how little 4 people could do against a grass fire driven by a dry wind across parched range. They arrived to find a wall of flame already a quarter-mile wide, moving with terrifying speed through grass that crackled and roared as it burned, cattle bawling in panic and scattering before it, some of them, Emma saw with a lurch of horror, too weak and thin from the drought to outrun the flames at all. "We cannot stop this alone," Cecil shouted over the roar of the fire, his face lit orange in the terrible light. "Emma, ride for Solace Creek, get every hand you can find. Tommy, Silas, help me cut what fence we can and drive the cattle we can reach toward the creek bed, where the ground is bare enough to break the fire's path." Emma did not argue, though every instinct screamed at her to stay and fight beside him. She turned her horse and rode for town as she had never ridden in her life, and it was perhaps the great mercy of that terrible day that Solace Creek was not so very far, and that ranching folk in that hard country had long ago learned that a fire on one spread was a fire that threatened them all. Within the hour, a dozen riders had gathered, neighbors who had watched Emma's struggle all summer with a mixture of sympathy and their own private fears. Men and women who understood that today it was Thatcher land burning, but tomorrow it could be their own. Even Willis Boone came, grim-faced and silent, his earlier jealousy forgotten in the face of shared disaster. They rode back together, armed with wet sacks, shovels, and a wagon loaded with what water barrels could be spared from the town well. By the time they reached the fire line, Cecil, Tommy, and Silas had managed to cut a rough fire break along the dry creek bed, dragging brush and dead grass clear of a wide swath of ground, and had driven perhaps 2/3 of the surviving cattle across to the safer side. The new arrivals threw themselves into the work immediately, beating at the advancing flames with wet sacks, widening the fire break with shovels and even bare hands, while Emma worked alongside them, her lungs burning with smoke, her eyes streaming, thinking of nothing but the next patch of flame in front of her. It was Cecil in the end who spotted the greatest danger, a tongue of fire that had leapt the natural break and was licking toward a stand of dry brush that, if it caught, would carry the flames directly toward the house and barn themselves. "Emma," he shouted, already running toward it with a shovel in hand. "The house." She followed, and together, joined swiftly by Tommy and two of the neighbor men, they threw themselves against that final dangerous tongue of flame, beating and digging and smothering it with wet sacks until, finally, agonizingly, it guttered and died, leaving nothing behind but smoking black earth and the acrid smell of victory bought at terrible cost. The fire burned itself out by nightfall, having consumed perhaps 800 acres of range and, tragically, 11 head of cattle too weak or too slow to escape it. But the house stood. The barn stood. And when Emma finally sat down on the porch steps, exhausted beyond words, her hands blistered and her face streaked black with soot, Cecil sank down beside her, equally spent, and neither of them could quite believe they had come through it. "We saved most of it," Tommy said, dropping down on Emma's other side, his young face gray with exhaustion and something older than his years. "We saved most of it," Emma agreed, her voice hoarse from smoke, "because our neighbors came when we needed them, and because Cecil Garrison had the sense to think of the house when the rest of us were only thinking of the flames in front of our faces." Silas, standing nearby with a wet rag pressed to a burn on his forearm, gave a tired grunt of agreement. "Never seen a stranger work so hard for land that was not his own," he said, looking at Cecil with something that might, in a man as reserved as Silas, have counted as deep respect. Cecil said nothing, only reached over in the darkness and found Emma's hand, and she let her head rest against his shoulder. And for a long while they simply sat together in the wreckage of the day, grateful beyond words simply to be alive and whole, with a house still standing and a family, however unconventional, still together. It was 2 days after the fire, while Emma and Cecil rode the burned range assessing what remained of the grazing land, that the sky finally, mercifully, began to change. It started small, a bank of clouds building on the western horizon in the late afternoon, the kind of clouds that had teased them a dozen times over the past year only to dissolve into nothing by evening, bringing not a drop of rain. Emma had learned not to hope for such clouds, had trained herself over 14 brutal months to expect disappointment, and so she said nothing, only watched them build with a wary, guarded eye. But these clouds did not dissolve. Through the afternoon they grew, darkening from white to gray to a deep bruised purple that Emma had almost forgotten skies could hold, and a wind began to rise, cooler than any wind she had felt in over a year, carrying with it a smell that took her a long moment to place because it had been so long since she had smelled it at all. Rain. The smell of rain coming. "Cecil," she said, her voice suddenly unsteady, pointing toward the building storm. "Do you smell that?" He reined in his horse beside her, tilting his face into the rising wind, and she watched something like disbelief and hope war across his features. "I do," he said slowly. "I surely do." They sat their horses together on the burned ridge, watching the storm build and roll toward them across the vast Texas sky, thunder beginning to rumble low and distant, lightning flickering deep within the purple mass of cloud. And Emma felt something break open in her chest that was equal parts terror and hope, because storms in that country could bring destruction as easily as relief, and she did not know, could not know, which this one would be. The first fat drops began to fall as they turned their horses for home, striking the parched, cracked earth with a sound like gunshots, sending up small puffs of dust where each one landed. And within minutes the drops had become a steady patter, and within a quarter hour a genuine rain, the first real rain the Thatcher ranch had seen in 14 months. By the time they reached the house, soaked through and laughing like children despite the seriousness of the year behind them, Tommy and Silas had come running out into the yard, faces turned up to the falling rain, arms spread wide as though to embrace it, and Emma dismounted and stood in the middle of the yard letting the rain soak through her dress and hair, tears mixing freely with the rain on her face, because after everything, the drought, cross, the fire, the long grinding fear of losing everything her father had built, the sky had finally finally answered. "I told you," she said, half laughing and half sobbing, looking up at Cecil where he stood a few feet away, equally soaked, watching her with an expression of pure wonder. "I told the sky I would not let this drought take everything I love, and I meant it as a promise to myself, Cecil, not truly believing anything was listening. But look at it. Just look." "Maybe it was listening after all," Cecil said, coming to stand close to her in the falling rain, water running down his face, his gray eyes bright with something that was not entirely about the weather. "Or maybe you simply willed it into being through sheer stubbornness, same as you have willed everything else on this ranch to survive." "Perhaps it was both," Emma said, and reached up to touch his rain-slicked face. And this time it was she who closed the distance between them, kissing him fully and without reservation in the middle of the yard in the pouring rain, while Tommy whooped and Silas turned away with a grin he did not quite manage to hide. The storm lasted through the night and into the following day, a slow, soaking rain of the kind that did not run off wasted but sank deep into thirsty ground, filling the new well, swelling the creek, bringing the first real green shoots of grass the range had seen in over a year within days of its passing. It was not, Emma knew, the end of all their troubles. One rain did not undo 14 months of drought, and the cattle lost, the range burned. The struggle ahead to rebuild would take months and years yet. But it was a beginning, a sign, and more than that. It was proof of something Emma had come to believe in over the course of that terrible, transformative summer. That the sky, however indifferent it might seem, was not entirely beyond reach of a heart determined enough to demand its mercy. That evening, with the rain still falling soft against the roof, and a fire crackling cheerfully in the hearth for the first time in months, Cecil found Emma alone on the porch, watching the rain fall silver in the light spilling from the windows. "Emma," he said, and something in the careful way he said her name made her turn to face him fully. "I came to this ranch 6 weeks ago as a stranger with a lame horse, and nothing to my name but a saddle and some hard-won knowledge of dry country," he said, turning his hat in his hands the way he did when nervous, a habit Emma had come to find endearing. "I did not expect in coming here to find the thing I had been missing since I lost my own place in Kansas. I did not expect to find you." Emma's heart was beating very fast, but she said nothing, only waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. "I love you, Emma Thatcher," Cecil said, simply and plainly, the way he said most things, without ornament but with absolute sincerity. "I love your stubbornness and your courage and the way you would rather fight the whole world than see this ranch fail. I do not have much to offer you, no land of my own, no fortune, only a strong back and a willingness to work beside you for the rest of my days, if you would have me. I am asking you to marry me, if you will do me that honor." Emma felt tears rising, this time entirely of joy, and she closed the distance between them, taking his face in both her hands. "Cecil Garrison," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you rode into my life with nothing but a lame horse and found water where I had given up hope of finding any. You stood beside me against Jedediah Cross when any sensible man would have ridden on. You fought fire with your bare hands to save a home that was not even yours. I do not need a man with land or fortune. I need a man with exactly the kind of heart you have shown me these past weeks, and I would be honored, more than honored, to be your wife." They married in October, once the worst of the rebuilding work was underway, and the range had begun its slow green recovery, in a small ceremony at the Solace Creek Church, attended by the whole scattered community that had come together to fight the fire, with Tommy standing as Cecil's groomsman despite being technically Emma's brother and giving her away both, and Silas weeping unashamedly in the front pew, claiming it was only the dust bothering his eyes. Jedediah Cross did not attend, and within a year had sold his own overextended holdings and moved on to Colorado, having overreached himself trying to buy up half a dozen struggling ranches during the drought and finding, once the rains returned and folks recovered their footing, that his neighbors had little forgiveness left for a man who had tried to profit from their suffering. Willis Boone, chastened by his own poor behavior at the dance and grateful, perhaps, for having been shown a better example by Cecil during the fire, eventually married a young schoolteacher from Amarillo and became, in time, a perfectly amiable neighbor to the newly formed Garrison household. Emma and Cecil rebuilt what the drought and fire had taken, slowly and steadily, over the following years. The rains, while never again quite so absent as that terrible year of 1878, remained unpredictable in the way of all Texas weather, and there were dry years yet to come, and hard seasons that tested them both. But they faced each one together, with the new well Cecil had found still giving sweet water from deep below the ridge, and the earthen dam still catching what rain did fall, and the herd slowly rebuilding from the survivors of that terrible summer. 3 years after their wedding, Emma gave birth to a son, whom they named Everett after her father, a strong and healthy boy who grew up chasing chickens across the same yard, where his mother had once stood in the pouring rain declaring her love for a drifter with a lame horse. 2 years after that came a daughter, Sarah, named for Cecil's own mother back in Kansas, a bright and curious child who from her earliest years showed a fascination with the old willow branch dowsing trick her father still occasionally practiced, more for tradition's sake than necessity, since the well remained true and strong. Silas Reed stayed on with the ranch until his death some 12 years later, a peaceful passing in his sleep after a long life of faithful service, and Emma and Cecil buried him beneath the same cottonwood where Everett Thatcher himself had been laid to rest, so that the two old ranch hands, father and hired man both, might rest together watching over the land they had both loved so fiercely. The Thatcher Garrison Ranch, as it came to be known throughout the county, prospered over the years that followed, becoming known not only for the quality of its cattle, but for the particular kindness of its owners, who never turned away a thirsty traveler or a family fallen on hard times, remembering always how a stranger's kindness and a bit of stubborn hope had carried them through the worst drought either of them had ever known. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children had been put to bed, Emma and Cecil still liked to sit together on that same porch where he had once proposed, watching the sun set over land that had, against all odds and through no small effort of their own combined will, survived and flourished. Sometimes on the driest evenings, when the wind carried that particular dusty smell that still made Emma's chest tighten with old memory, Cecil would reach over and take her hand. "Remember that first drought?" he would say, not quite a question. "I remember," Emma would answer every time, looking up at whatever sky happened to stretch above them that evening, clear or clouded, gentle or threatening. "I remember standing on that ridge and screaming a promise at the stars, not truly believing anyone was listening." And were they? Cecil would ask, though he had asked the same question 100 times before and always received the same answer. "Something was," Emma would say, leaning her head against his shoulder as the Texas sky turned gold and rose and violet above the land they had built together, the family they had raised together, the love that had grown, improbably and beautifully, out of the hardest, driest season either of them had ever known. Something was listening after all. And in the quiet of those evenings, with their children's laughter drifting from the house behind them and the cattle grazing contentedly on grass grown green and full once more, neither Emma Thatcher Garrison nor Cecil Garrison ever doubted, not for one moment, that the vow she had shouted at an indifferent sky so many years before had been heard, and answered in every way that truly mattered.